All right, guys, hopefully you got to know your partner a little bit better today. We're going to be working on various math problems with them today. And let's go ahead and dive in and use this process, this skill that hopefully you guys just discovered in the homework last night. So we are going to continue in our study of quadratics. How do you solve quadratics? Monday, we looked at how to solve quadratics using factoring. The question that comes into play is, what if the quadratic is not factorable? Well, we're going to learn a process called completing the square that will allow you to solve any quadratic equation. Before doing so, however, we have to walk through a few prerequisite skills. Numbers 1 through 4, we're going to solve by, and I'm sorry, this is a typo, if you could like X this out. We're going to solve this by taking the square root, which is a skill you need in learning how to complete the square. So looking at number 1, if you have x squared is equal to 4, how do we solve by taking the square root? Hopefully it's so easy that you're like, is she really asking this? Basically, you would ask, what undoes a square? What's the answer? What undoes a square? Square root. So we could square root both sides. The square root undoes the square, and we're left with x is equal to what? 2. Could x equal anything else? Nice, Claire. It could be plus or minus 2. Here's the key. Whenever you take the square root in an equation, you need a plus or minus. If you want to see, well, why? If we check this answer, if I check and ask, is 2 squared equal to 4? Why, yes, it is. And is negative 2 squared equal to 4? Yes, because a negative times a negative equals a positive. So that's a really important concept to make sure that you have under your belt before we really move on. Number 1, I'm going to do a little exclamation point. If you take the square root in an equation, it requires a plus or minus. So hopefully I'm going to be saying this a lot over these next few days. When you take the square root in an equation, what do you need? And your answer is plus or minus. You always really want to make sure that you are keeping that in mind. All right, let's use it with number 2. Number 2, what undoes a square? Square root, good. So we're going to square root, and that would give me x is equal to, what do I need to keep in mind when taking a square root? Plus or minus. So my answer would be plus or minus square root of 13. Now, 13 is not a perfect square, so I can just leave it in simplest radical form. That's the answer, plus or minus root 13. Okay, let's keep using this skill. Let's go on to number 3. Number 3 says, now apply the process to the equations of the following form. Number 3, I want to get x by itself. I'm solving for x. So I see a square. My question is, what undoes a square? Square root. So I square root this side, and whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do to the other. The square root undoes the square, and that gives me x minus 2 is equal to, what do I need to keep in mind when taking a square root? Plus or minus. Good. So I have plus or minus square root of 13. Now, plus or minus is 2 different answers. So when I'm solving for x, I should have 2 different solutions. You can just separate them right here and show that x minus 2 has to equal a positive root 13, and x minus 2 has to equal a negative root 13. Now I have to solve for x. Right now, x has been subtracted by 2. So what undoes a minus? Plus, so I'll add 2. Are 2 and square root 13 like terms? No, so I just call it 2 plus root 13. If I look at the second equation, same thing, add 2. Are 2 and negative root 13 like terms? No, so I'm just going to leave it as 2 minus root 13. The other way to express this set of solutions is to say that x is equal to 2 plus or minus square root of 13. All right, on to the next one. Number 4. Number 4, I'd like you to stop and consider what would be your dream profession. Your dream profession. Turn to your partner, tell them what would be your dream profession. Mariah, do you mind working with Tamikio today? All right, the person who would take more schooling to get to their dream profession. You turn to your partner and tell them, what would you do in number 4? Oh, you're saying like because really like think about the square root here. Here. Square root. All right, guys, I'm seeing good things. The one thing we do want to be careful with is these are like terms. I can take x plus 1 equal to 3 and x plus 1 equal to negative 3, and I can combine these. I should get an answer of x is equal to 2 and x is equal to negative 4. Okay, any questions on using that skill? Taking the square root. All right, then let's move on. One last thing we need to do before we can truly understand the process of solving by completing the square is we need to go back to really what you did in last night's homework. You need to know how to factor what are called perfect square trinomials. So these are very similar to what you did in last night's homework. See if you on your own can factor each of these. All right, guys, I'm seeing some people write it as parentheses times parentheses, which is great. But if you have the same parentheses, we can just write it as the quantity squared. So we should have x plus 1 squared, x plus 3 squared, x minus 4 squared, and x plus 5 squared. Lydia. Yes, that's right. Okay, now we looked at in the review of the homework what we need to do to fill in the blank. Do you guys remember if you were asked to, this is really called complete the square. Here, I'm just asking you, if you were asked to fill in the blank, what can we do with the middle number 12 to determine what that answer would be? Divide it by 2, nice. And then what are we going to do with that value? Square it, awesome. So this is going to become 36. This process is called completing the square. It's really important that you know that, how to do that. So you might want to just go ahead and give yourself a little note. Taking half the middle coefficient and squaring it is called completing the square. Tamikio.
I think that because I knew starting at 9 plus 4 is 12, so I knew it has to be less than 12
But that, so let me ask you, like, what if I asked you x squared plus, I don't know, let me think of a number, 20x. What would you add there then? 10, and it has to factor down into x plus 10 squared. So you have to do that process in order to know what would factor down into a quantity squared. Good question. All right, guys, now that we've kind of have all the skills we need to know how to solve by completing the square, we're gonna go ahead and jump in. If you forget what to do, the steps are off to the side. I'm gonna walk through this one just step by step, and then we'll move through a few more together, and hopefully you will feel more confident and can start the homework for the first section. So number 1, it says solve the following quadratic equations by completing the square. In fact, if you tried to solve it via factoring, you could not. Marin. It'll tell you, but we're also going to look at tomorrow key components of an equation that can help you decipher which method is best based off of the equation given. Good question. Okay, so here's the process. Number 1, make sure the leading coefficient, your A value, is equal to 1. I told you guys that in the homework last night, that all of those coefficients had to be 1. That was important to be able to use this process. So looking at number 1, the coefficient is 1. Sweet. Step number 1 done. Step number 2, move all the x's to one side and all the numbers to the other side. So which one do we have to put to the other side? Which one doesn't have x? 8. Good, the minus 8. So we need to move that to the other side. So I'm going to add it, and that's going to give me, now do this with me, leave a space after the 4x. So when I recopy this down, I'm going to write down x squared minus 4x. I'm going to leave a space on purpose is equal to 8. Now, even if you're not reading the steps on the side, why do you think I left a space? What do you think I'm going to do here? Complete the square. So now, how do we complete the square? What do I do with the middle number? Divide it by 2 and square it. Here's the beauty of this. You can go ahead and keep the negative sign, or you can disregard the negative sign. Let me ask you why. What is a negative value squared? Positive. What's a positive value squared? Positive. So since we're going to square it, it doesn't matter if you keep the sign with it or not. I'll go ahead, I'll keep the sign with it here just so we can see that it's going to fly away. But what's negative 4 divided by negative 2? Or what's negative 4 divided by 2? Negative 2, and then what's negative 2 squared? 4. So I'm going to add 4 here. Now you guys have been in math long enough now to know that if you add something to one side of the equation, what do you have to do to the other side? Add it. Add the same exact number. So whatever you complete the square with, you have to add to the other side. Now, why did we do that? So that we can create a situation just like we did at the top of the notes. We added 4 so that this will factor down into something squared. So as I factor this piece down, it's going to create a quantity squared. I know that. But do you know what? What is going to go in the parentheses? 2. And x, is it going to be x minus 2 or is it going to be x plus 2? Well, how do we know? How do I know if it's going to be x plus or x minus? Lydia?
If you- I don't know, if you have,
Yes. What? Yeah.
I think it's a 4.
I completed the square. So I took half of the middle term and squared it.
I don't know how to do it with plus 4.
On this side or this side?
Either.
I use this skill that we learned above, what's called completing the square. I took half, oh, there it went. I took half of the middle term and squared it so that I could create something that would factor down into a quantity squared. So I use the pattern that I observed that happened in your homework and what we just did here to see what would I need to do to this middle number to add a value which will factor down into something squared. So the other way to look at it is I'm walking through steps 3 and 4. I took half the b term and I squared it. The b term, if you look at the ax squared plus bx plus c, it's the middle number. So I'm taking half of the middle number and then I'm going to square it. I'm doing that on purpose so that it'll factor down into something squared. Yep, and then what's 2 squared? 4. So I'm adding 4 and 4 to both sides of the equation. I square what I halved. Yep.
And then you put it where the other.
Yes. I think you're confused because you were gone when we left a space there on purpose. So I think, hold on to your question. We'll do it again in the next problem. I think because you'll be here for the whole thing, it'll make even more clarity. Okay. Margot. Not if you're asked to solve by completing the square. What? It would work, yeah. But if the quadratic formula came from this process, so it's important that you understand the process. Okay, if you guys are unsure how to factor, you can use what some of you did and when I was walking around. You can say the last term's positive, so it's going to be the same sign as the middle term, minus and minus. X times x would give me x squared. 2 times 2 is what would give me 4 and add up to negative 4x. So that factors down into x minus 2 squared is equal to 12. Now this should look very similar to what we just solved above. How do I continue? What undoes a square? Square root, so I'm going to square root, square root. The square root cancels out the square. And I have x minus 2 is equal to, what do I need to keep in mind when taking the square root in an equation? Plus or minus. So I have plus or minus square root of 12. Okay, here's some good final review. How do I simplify the square root of 12? How do we simplify that radical if you're asked to keep it in simplest radical form? Marin? Okay, nice. If we factor it down, it's 2 times 2 times 3. Do you guys remember if the index is 2, how many of the same factor do you need before you can pull it out? 2. So this is going to actually simplify to 2 root 3. So now we have x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus 2 root 3. There's one final thing we have to do. Tamikio. What, 6 times 2, and then 6 is 2 times 3, right? Awesome. Okay, now last thing I have to do is get x by itself. So what undoes a minus? Plus, so I'm going to plus 2. Those are not like terms, so I'm just going to leave that as 2 plus or minus 2 root 3. I know that that's two solutions. That's 2 plus 2 root 3 and 2 minus 2 root 3, but I could just represent it as 1. Okay, guys, we're going to do this again until hopefully you feel more comfortable with the steps. We're just walk through it one step at a time. So let's go ahead and look at the next one. Number two, step 1, make sure x squared has a coefficient of 1. It does here. Step 2, make sure the variables are on one side, the x's, and the numbers are on the other. That's already done for you. So we're actually going to jump to step 3 and 4 of number 2. Number 3 and 4 is really to complete the square. So now I'm going to ask you to recopy this and leave a space next to the 2x. So I'm going to recopy it, x squared minus 2x. I'm going to leave a space is equal to 5. I am going to purposefully add a number to the left side and the right side that will allow me to factor this down into a quantity squared. The question is, what is that number? What am I going to add to this side and this side? How do we find it? What do we do? Nice. Take the middle number, which is 2, divide it by 2. You could call it negative 2 because negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. But if you square that, what is negative 1 squared come out to be? 1. So I'm going to add 1 here. And if you add a number to the left side of the equation, what do you have to do to the right? Add it to the right. Now, the reason that you did that is so that you could factor the left side down. If I'm looking at how do I factor it, some of us like to think through it in terms of the 2 parentheses. The last term's positive, so I know I'm going to have the same sign as the middle term, minus and minus. X times x would give me x squared. 1 times 1 gives me 1. So my answer is x minus 1 squared is equal to 5 plus 1 is 6. Moving right along, what undoes a square? Square root, good. So I'm going to square root, and that gives me x minus 1 is equal to, what do I need to keep in mind when taking a square root? Plus or minus, so I have plus or minus root 6. Last thing I need to do, add 1. Are 1 and root 6 like terms? No, so I'm just going to leave it as 1 plus or minus square root of 6. Can 6 be, or can the square root of 6 be simplified? No, 6 is 2 times 3. There's no set of the same factors that go in. So this would be my answer. Does that help working through that one? Lydia? Yeah. Awesome. All right, let's keep doing it. Let's do a number 3. Number 3, step 1, make sure that x squared has a coefficient of 1. There's something wrong here. What is it? What's happening? What's in front of the x squared? Negative 3. Negative 3 has been multiplied by x squared. What undoes multiplication? Division. So what we can do is divide both sides of the equation by negative 3. As long as if I divide one side of the equation by a number, the only thing I have to do is be consistent and divide the other side of the equation by that number. And now the equation still remains true. It still remains balanced. You do have to keep in mind that when you're dividing 3 terms by a number, you have to divide each term by that value. So negative 3 divided by negative 3 would give me x squared. What's 6 divided by negative 3? Good, negative 2. And what's negative 1 divided by negative 3? 1/3, nice. What's 0 divided by negative 3? 0. Okay, now I know I need to complete the square, but right now something's blocking me. What's blocking me from completing the square? The 1/3. So what do I have to do with the 1/3? If I multiply it by 3, then I get that coefficient back. But could I move it to the other side? Yeah, so let's just subtract it to the other side. Subtract. And that gives me x squared minus 2x is equal to negative 1/3. And now I need to use the process of completing the square. What I'd like you to do is turn to your partner and the person with the dream profession that would take less schooling. You turn and tell them, what should we add to both sides of the equation? Jack, you understand it so far?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. All right, guys, take a look. You should have said 1 and 1. And now with that said, let's keep moving through. What does this factor down into? It's going to be something squared. Anyone know what it's going to be? Good, x minus 1. X minus 1 squared is equal to, whoa, how do I add negative 1/3 plus 1? We need, it's a fraction. And what do fractions need? So did you say change 1 to a fraction? Nice. 1 is the same as 1/1. And then what do I need before I can add those two? Common denominator. So I'll multiply that by 3/3. What's negative 1/3 plus 3/3? 2/3. All right, now I'm here. What undoes a square? Square root, square root, square root. That cancels. And now I have x minus 1 is equal to, what do I need to keep in mind when taking the square root? Plus or minus. So I have plus or minus. Now here's some free final review. In the final, you will be asked to rationalize the denominator. Do you guys remember that square root of 2/3 is the same as the square root of 2 over the square root of 3? Do you remember how to get rid of a radical in the denominator? Do you remember what you multiply by? You're going to multiply by 1, but in what form? It's going to be a number over a number. Nice, Fiona. √3 over √3. So that you can get rid of the square root in the denominator. Because that'll give me √6 over √9, which √9 equals 3. Okay, so that's plus or minus √6 over 3. If you didn't quite grasp that, there will be more time to review for the final, and I don't believe that shows up in your homework tonight. But the last and final thing that we need to do is do what? Shimikyo? Yeah. Because I multiplied 2 times 3 to give me 6. And what's square root of 3 times square root of 3? Yeah, just 3. Well, it's the square root of 9. What is the square root of 9? 3. Yeah. Okay, so then we would add 1 to both sides. And we get x is equal to 1 plus or minus square root of 6 over 3. Margot. Uh-huh. I factored it. Yeah, I said what, like the last term's positive, so I know I'm gonna have the same signs as the middle term. And then I'd have x and x and 1 and 1. So it factors to x minus 1 squared. All right, guys, I think it would be a good point right now to stop and work on homework to practice using this skill. So I'm gonna go ahead and show the book up on the screen. The homework is 17 through 19 and 25 and 27, I believe. So I'm gonna go ahead, put that up, and you guys can go ahead and get working. Let me go ahead and